Hey there, and welcome to the Dynamics Hot Dish Podcast, serving up stories and knowledge on Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform. This is what's hot in Dynamics. You're now joining Merlin Schweiger, Liz McGlennon, and Ashley Steiner.
So did you guys hear that Microsoft is making like the RPA process on desktops for free for Windows 10?
Yeah, I did see that, which is kind of surprising because the RPA was the more expensive license of Power Automate before.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how it'll change like how we use our desktops. I mean, I'm not as familiar with the RPAs.
Yeah, I was actually just looking, this was actually literally just yesterday, I was in Power Automate looking at they've got like a process analyzer that's in preview right now. And I assume it probably ties into this free offering. You can record like your workday, like a task that you're doing in RPA desktop, which is now free. And then you feed it to this process analyzer and it will analyze the process and then give you feedback on how you could make it more efficient and how you could automate it. And it'll tell you like analytics, if you have like a bunch of different users record it over like multiple different sessions, then it'll tell you like, I don't know, like your users are doing it these different ways and here's how you could fix it. I don't know, it seemed pretty cool. But
it does, yeah.
So it says that it comes with like 370, maybe 400 pre-built like actions for you. Is that one of them then? How hard do you think it is to customize this?
I mean, so the actions as far as RPA is concerned is like open a program or like navigate to a URL or click on a button or stuff like that. So I assume most of those actions are, you can interact with most of the things that you're doing, but it's literally like, it's like click and keystroke recording. So you click to open this application and you record that, and then you copy this field out of here and you paste it in over there, and it's recording that. And in like the real RPA stuff, you would automate all of that so that you could integrate systems that don't have an API or that are like too old or somebody else's system you don't have access to, and you could like automate all those clicks. I'm actually really curious to see sort of like how Microsoft is planning to roll this out to desktops. Is this like every week I have to run a status report, and so I'm just going to like record the status report process and then just like click play and sit back and be like, all right, run my status reports, and just like let it do it? I don't know.
So I'm wondering, like, how routine and repetitive are people's work processes, or like how much of what people do does require some like human thought?
I mean, most of my emails are just like, okay, sounds good, so I could probably automate that.
How would you know which ones like say that to though?
Oh, literally all of them.
Oh,
all
okay.
of them.
So Merlin doesn't read his emails.
That's so funny. I just want, like, Liz, I think that's a great point. Like, at what point it seems like machines are taking over the process rather than like that human intervention. So can you like potentially replace positions and save money? I hate to say it like that, but it almost seems like it's a time or efficiency saver.
Well, I think the goal is to have humans working on things that add more value. Like if it is super concrete and routine, like why make a person copy and paste the same thing or go through the same process, manually on a recurring basis?
Right. You should have the computer do that. And then the human, you don't have to fire them. They just have to do the stuff that requires their brain.
Right.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But are people ready for that? Like if someone's in our role today that maybe doesn't require critical thinking, are they prepared to move into a role that does?
Don't know.
And I'm intrigued to see how this like plays out. I mean, because right now it's, there was a charge for having this on your desktop. I think it was like $15 a month. So kind of excited to see like what the adoption is once it becomes free, if people do start to use it and how it's helpful.
Yeah. And I'm curious to see how it ties into like the cloud licensing. Like, can I use this free version to record a process and then like turn it into an unattended bot in RPA Online? Like, I don't know. It'll be interesting.
Yeah, definitely something I want to follow. Sorry, Liz.
So for the desktop app, like, do you have to have your computer on or like your laptop open for it to run, or will it just run even if your computer is off?
How would it run if your computer is off?
Well, the unattended one does.
It still has to run somewhere. It's running on a virtual machine or it's running on a server, but it has to run somewhere because it's literally like executing like the person. It's moving the mouse and clicking the buttons.
Yeah, that wasn't my question. That's fine.
Well, so your computer has to be on.
Okay.
Your computer has to be on.
For all of them? Or just the desktop app that we're talking about?
For the free desktop app, I assume your computer has to be on.
Okay.
For the unattended bot license with Power Automate, your desktop does not have to be on, but something somewhere has to be on, and that's where the bot runs.
Thank you. That was my question.
So this is exciting. I think that we should definitely like follow this because I mean, just anywhere that they implement like the Power Platform things into our everydays is really cool. But definitely want to get into the topic that we're chatting about today, which is Agile versus Waterfall. I know that I had a big transition. I think I don't want to say that one's like outdated because I think they're both like useful in their own right. But would love to hear kind of like your guys' thoughts before I go into the story of how I was introduced to Agile.
Well, I wonder if we should kind of define what we mean when we say Waterfall and Agile first.
Good idea.
Yeah.
What do you think of, Liz, when you think of Agile versus Waterfall?
So
Then I'll go.
I will caveat that I think most businesses do some sort of hybrid and that very few businesses do pure Waterfall or pure Agile anymore. I guess my experience, and I don't have any formal like PM training, so my experience is from the companies I've worked for and the projects I've been on, is that Waterfall, especially from a D365 Power Platform, like software technology perspective, is where you spend a ton of time gathering requirements up front. You get very detailed, you document it all, you get sign off on that, and then you go and build. You go and build kind of without input for a period of time, maybe weeks, months. And then you go back and you have testing and you get feedback during testing. Whereas Agile, and there's different types of Agile, right? Like Scrum, is where you get just high level information. And then during the sprint or like kind of on a weekly or 2-week basis, you review, you iterate, and you kind of constantly adjust and get feedback.
Yep. Sounds about right.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you just said, Liz. When I think of Agile, I think of incremental. So everything that you're doing is like in small increments over time to get to that end goal, maybe of what you have later on. Or sometimes you don't even know what the end goal is. You just keep doing these increments to get to, where you need to be. I would say, and then also like, so Waterfall, I don't want to say that like one is faster than the other, but you tend to build things at a different pace, obviously, like you said, because with the Agile, you're constantly building and gathering feedback at the same time. So there's no definition of like, this is in scope or this is out of scope, because you're kind of changing the scope as you go along based on what is being built. Where in Waterfall, you would have a scope and then you would say this is out of scope or, to build into this.
Yep.
Yeah. I feel like, I know, Ashley, you kind of started with, like, I don't want to say one's outdated, but Waterfall's been around longer and Agile is a newer methodology. And so I think, Waterfall is just a more traditional approach.
Right. Which actually sort of works against Agile a lot of times because it's kind of the new, like, upstart methodology. I feel like you get a lot of, so there are sort of like the different flavors, but you also get a lot of like Agile zealots who are so like focused on the terminology and the process and what it does and doesn't mean. And they really get all like spun up on, no, like this is not what a Scrum is for. This is not what a retrospective is. We have to do these 3 things in the retrospective. And they get kind of stuck on the terminology. And then anybody who's outside of that looks in and says, well, that just seems like a bunch of craziness. I don't want to do that. I'm just going to go back to what I'm comfortable with, which is gather and document requirements and then do some work.
I would say you're completely right. Because I mean, I've worked obviously in multiple organizations, in both methodologies. And the agile tends to be very entrepreneurial, I would feel like. So, with your start, it's that mentality of like, I'm starting up, I don't know where this is going to grow to yet. I know I want something. So we're just going to continue to do it over time. And I'll say traditionally, I'm very much the opposite, where I'm like, I want to sit down, I want to understand the full scope of what we're doing, what our end goal is. And so I think it's training yourself to handle both, or to be able to do both, has been actually, I will admit, a struggle for me to get on board with Agile, just because that's not the way that my brain works.
I think it's hard for organizations too. Like if you're signing off on a project, like what executive really wants to hear, we don't know what you're going to get at the end because we're doing Agile, right? Like pure Agile. Like that uncertainty or the amount of flexibility that it brings can make, I think, decision makers or organizations very uncomfortable. It also, I think it has a risk to inflate timeline and budget, et cetera. Yeah. Now, they'll probably get results along the way or have things that are delivered. It's just you don't know when or what necessarily.
Which is interesting. And I say that that's interesting because I am now in an organization where I am trying to push Agile as the way to go, because I firmly believe that it's better, faster, and cheaper. But, and there's some caveats there, right? Because you're right, the perception from the executive side is, well, look, I'm buying a system and I need the system to do X, Y, and Z. If it doesn't do X, Y, and Z, by the time this project is over, then I will have wasted my money and I will be upset. And so you put an agile methodology in front of them and say, well, you'll probably get X, Y, and Z, but I can't promise it. And maybe we'll get to the end and you'll actually have X, Y, and W, and we never quite got to Z. And that makes that executive feel uncomfortable.
Or maybe X, Y, and Z is like what you thought you needed, but it's really not what you need. And you don't know that until you start talking to the stakeholders. And
that's why I think doing it waterfall is generally such a terrible idea, because what if Z is not actually what you need? Like what you needed all along was W. But if you wrote the contract and you're running a project X, Y, and Z, and the project team halfway through is like, guys, Z is not at all what we need. Like, I understand what we're going for. We thought that's what we needed. Now that we understand the capabilities of the platform, that's a terrible idea. Well, I guess we can do a change order and try to change the scope up. Whereas if it's agile, you just sort of naturally get there. And I feel like the executive who is concerned about the risk of not getting what they signed up for with agile is not understanding and trusting the role of their product owner on their side. Because that's the beauty of agile, is at each sprint, you're setting what the next priority is. And if your product owner isn't setting the right priority, that's on you. Like, your product owner needs to understand what your vision is so they can say, I know that we need to solve this problem, so that is going to be a priority above all of these other kind of nice to have things.
Well, I think part of the fear, the stigma around agile is that oftentimes projects are run agile, but the appropriate roles aren't filled or clarified. Like, there is no product owner from the customer side. And so without that role being clear, it's at risk.
Yeah.
I think that also makes it seem chaotic. You know what I mean? Because you're kind of always changing, you're developing as you go, you're moving pieces and parts around constantly. So from the outside looking in, that can look really chaotic and like it's unorganized. So I think that can scare executives, especially away when they see like a project running disorganized.
It's true.
Yeah.
I mean, and admittedly, it's not like the agile adherents do themselves any favors when they, like, I feel like often agile is like an excuse to just like not do any documentation. Like, oh, no, we're not going to write any of this down because we're doing this agile.
Okay, can we talk about like tools or methods to document and kind of maybe waterfall and agile and how the tools vary? Because like I personally love using Azure DevOps for agile projects, but like all the waterfall projects I've been on, it's more like Excel spreadsheets and Word documents and Visios. Not that those don't have a place in an agile project, like those can be very useful supporting documents, but like not everything lives in a static file, so to speak. What have
Right.
you guys used?
Same.
Yeah, so you said Azure DevOps, that's what you use. I've not used that. Even in an agile environment, we've still used static things like, or a OneNote or shared documents in a shared space. So
Okay.
that might be something I'm going to write down and say, hey,
Well, and it
this
used
could
to
really
be
help us.
Yeah, it used to be called like VSTS or TFS. Like Jira is another one I've used that's like a competitor and equivalent to DevOps.
Okay,
Mhm.
so yeah, have used Jira a lot and Jira-like tools.
Yeah, so it's really similar to that.
Okay.
Right. And I think if used properly, those tools can give you better documentation than like your Word document, because you can, like, on a specific work item, like you got one user story to do whatever, you can have like a whole conversation through like comments and file attachments and screenshots and whatever else on that item, so that if a decision is made, you document that decision somewhere in those comments, like, I don't know, I think we should do it this way because of these reasons. Okay, agreed, let's do it that way. Now you've got that, like, that rationale for how this decision was made. You're never going to get that in that Word document, right? Like, I gathered all these requirements in these, review meetings. That context is lost 2 years down the road. Somebody new comes in and says, well, why did you do it that way instead of this way? I have no idea. Well, I don't think you should have done it that way. And then they rebuild it. And then you discover 3 months later, oh, that breaks this other downstream process. Oh, that's why we did it that way.
I was gonna say, yeah, unless you want like a Word document with a bunch of comments in it and like red lines.
Right.
I feel like it's so hard to comprehend. Like if you were going back a year later or a new person, like reading through a massive Word document that's red lines and comments is like, you can't comprehend it. And it's not easily like searchable like a tool like Jira or DevOps is.
Agreed. Have you ever went back and read one of those Word documents? Like I can't ever say that after it's been over, like I've gone back and been like, oh, why did we make this? You know what I mean? Because you're not going to find what you're looking for.
I've gotten it. Like I've been on a recovery project or like a phase 2 or something where like you get like all this documentation, but it's not useful. Like it's very hard to consume that and get the context and the value to like Merlin's point.
Yeah. And I feel like that's the ironic side then on the waterfall approach is it's everybody thinks that they're going to get documentation and that they need that documentation. So they have to do it waterfall because they need the business requirements document and the functional design document and the technical design document. Great. They get those documents and they're not necessarily thinking about the fact that they paid thousands of dollars for those documents. And then nobody updates them. And they sit on somebody's file share for 3 years and then they're out of date because the system has moved on and nobody went back to update the documentation because, well, that's going to take 6 times longer than just making the change. And now what value is that documentation? Whereas if you're managing those ongoing enhancements also in the same tool in Jira or in Azure DevOps, now you've got those user stories, you've got the comments on those user stories, and you can tie all those things together and say, okay, all of this applies to the same set of functionality. If I need to understand how this one thing works, I can just look through these work items and be like, oh, okay, now I see where we are. But you have to use it right too.
I mean, I definitely don't want people to think though that like waterfall can't be successful, because I think that there are places in some organizations where it is the right methodology to use. But I do think that IT organizations in general and just people working with technology are moving more towards the agile, because I don't want to say it's more free form, but it is, right? You can start, hey, this is what we think we're going to do, and end up somewhere completely different that actually fits the needs. Where your project with something in waterfall, your timeline might be 9 months, and what you started 9 months ago might be completely out of date with even what the product has, because you stuck within the scope, you stuck within all of that. Whereas if you did agile, you could change based on new features coming out or things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Like, I feel like we're kind of bashing waterfall, and there's a time and a place, and where our perspective is D365 and Power Platform projects. I do think that, even a different technology project or a different project altogether, waterfall might be the right approach, or is the right approach. like what we do is so flexible and it changes so fast. Like I think that's your point, that it lends to Agile being more productive or more efficient than Waterfall.
I'd also
Our
say
particular technology.
I'd also say it's a buy-in, because I've worked with customers or clients, before, where they just could not get a grasp on Agile, because it does take a lot more of their time, right? There's a lot more the ending customer, right? Whoever's going to use the system, it takes more of their time. It takes more of, it's less planning up front, and it's more like, hey, we need this on like the spot, or like, Johnny on the go, right? It's like, you need this right then. And so it's some companies cannot move to that as fast or as easily. I will just say it's a culture thing sometimes.
Okay, so I get that. I get that it's new for some people still. Like, how do you guys feel about Agile? Like, if they're not ready for pure Agile, like, how do you actually feel about the hybrid approach?
I'm sorry, what did you call it?
Agile?
The first for me.
Really?
So my previous employer, there was somebody who said there's no such thing as Wagile. Wagile is just waterfall done poorly. Like, if you're going to do waterfall, just do waterfall. And if you're going to do Agile, do Agile. Like, trying to mix and match, like, it doesn't.
I feel like everyone's mixing and matching these days. When was the last time either of you were on? And Merlin, I know your business now is different because you're like, we're doing Agile. But before Next Step, like, when was the last time you did pure Agile or pure Waterfall?
I think I would argue that, so Wagile, or like the hybrid, is generally you gather your requirements up front like Waterfall, and then you do kind of iterative development. So instead of disappearing for 6 months and then coming back with like, all right, it's done, like test it, you're doing that in smaller pieces. I think I would still call that Waterfall. And the reason that I would call that is because you're still gathering all of your requirements up front. And that's then defining what you're building for the next 3, 6, 9 months, right? Like, so you're not changing.
So you're saying like it's Waterfall, it's just a more modern version.
Right.
Like Waterfall's adapted to like,
Right.
We're not just going to disappear for 6 months.
Right. And I think that's easier to do with a platform-based tool like Dynamics, like Power Platform, where you can just build out a thing and say, okay, I built out your cases, like, let's go through it, give me feedback, and then we'll move on to the next thing, and then we'll move on to the next thing. But all of those things have already been, like, the requirements have already been gathered for all of those. So I would still call it Waterfall. I don't like the Wagile term.
Fair enough.
If Matt's listening, I'm sorry, Matt, but I don't like it.
Hopefully Matt's listening. So I actually work at a company that does complete Agile. My boss, hopefully he's not listening to this, would completely like panic if he saw anything that resembled Waterfall, just because culturally that's what we've adopted. Even the president of my current company has very much adopted like the Agile, like, okay, this is where we think we're gonna go and this is what we need to do, but where we actually end up might be a better solution than what we initially intended with. That also allows for fast failure. That's one of the things that I really like about Agile, is that if you know you're on the wrong path, you can just kind of stop where you are and say, nope, we need to go in a different direction. Mm-hmm. And in Waterfall, I feel like failure is a 4-letter word.
You could lose so much time failing on a Waterfall project too.
Absolutely. Yep. Resources, time, money, just everything. And so in Agile, it allows you to just course correct so much more quickly. So that's one of the things and benefits I like of Agile, especially working in an Agile shop now.
So since you're pure Agile, like what type of Agile are you running? Are you doing Scrum?
Yep, Scrum, and sprint planning, meetings, daily stand-ups.
Nice.
Yeah.
If anyone listening is doing safe Agile, apparently it's not real Agile, so...
What is Safe Agile?
Yeah, what's Safe Agile?
It's another one of the flavors. It's like, I don't remember who designed it, but it was like one of the, like IBM or something, like came up with like, well, we'll call it Agile, but really we'll run it like it's Waterfall, but we'll call it Agile so that these corporations think that they're doing things Agile, and they'll be like, we're Agile, but it's Safe Agile. So there's no risk. It's just Waterfall. Sorry.
I will say it is scary to make the switch. Like, so I remember what was 6-7 years ago, the first time I was introduced to Agile. It's probably been around longer than that, but I'd never worked at a company that had adopted that methodology. And the company I was working at got a new CIO who was like, this is where we need to move. This could save us time, money. I mean, all the things that we've said. And at first, everything took longer, like things were slow. You had to and that's from my perspective, not having been in the IT department, right, in that organization. And so I think that that's one of the things that people have to recognize, is that it's not an easy transition. And you also have to be willing to take the time to learn it. Where you might be thinking, oh, we've always done Waterfall. We can get it done faster in Waterfall. We have these safeguards set up for Waterfall. But if you do make the transition, there's pain points and change anywhere. So I will say that I was not a fan of Agile, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is the worst, because that was my first introduction to it, and I thought it was horrible. But obviously I've come a long way since then.
I remember my first pure Agile project as well. And I was fortunate to have a certified Scrum Master to help, because no one else knew what it was. No one else understood the differences, or it was everyone knew Waterfall, and you're trying to adapt, and it's confusing and it's frustrating. And I feel like it took us a few months and a few restarts, and then finally they're we just need to kind of reset as a project team and train everyone, and explain why we need all these ceremonies, and what their roles are, and that the Scrum Master is not a PM in the traditional sense. And eventually, after a lot of pain and practice and kind of training, we got to a flow where I would say it was pure Agile, and it was running pretty well. But it was definitely, a transition for a bunch of people that had never been on a pure Agile project before.
Sure, which makes sense. I mean, the way that you're approaching your scope totally shifts.
Yeah, and at a large organization too that wanted reports and structure and a plan. And so the management wanted kind of Waterfall deliverables, but at the same time said run Scrum. So right. Very conflicting messaging, yeah.
And I feel like that's what happens more often than not, is management says, do this Agile, but I need a status report. I need a project plan for the next 6 months in detail. It's but these two things are not compatible with each other. You either need to trust that the team will get done what you need done, or you need to have the team sit down and spend a bunch of time building out that 6-month plan and realize that you're just going to run this waterfall.
So we've talked a lot about the differences between them. How do you guys best learn Agile? If somebody's listening to this and say, okay, I now recognize my company and I've always run things Waterfall, but we want to learn how to run Agile, what is the best way to do that?
I would start by saying it depends on your role. If you are a PM trying to become a Scrum Master, go to Scrum training. Go to training, it will help. If you're just a participant to some degree, I think if you have someone else at your organization, or you can hire a consultant to kind of coach you through it, just start practicing it. I think it just kind of apply it to your next project and start practicing it would be my 2 cents.
Yeah, give it a try. I was going to say, legitimately, the only training that I've gotten on Agile was I went to 1 day of Scrum at scale. But I felt even just that 1 day gave me enough of a context to be okay, I understand how this is supposed to work. And I mean, to both of your points, it's not okay, I understand how this is supposed to work. Now I can just run a successful project this way. It's not going to be that seamless.
It's not going to be perfect the first time you try it.
The first one's going to be kind of ugly, but especially if you've got other people who've already done this, who can sort of help walk you through it. And as long as everybody sort of understands their responsibility on the team, then everything will be fine. Kind of circling all the way back to the product owner needs to know what their role is. They have to make the decisions. And the Scrum Master needs to know that they're not a project manager. They're just there to make sure that everybody is cool and doesn't have any blockers. And everybody else is just all right, I'm working on this. And you just do that thing.
Can I ask a question about sprint retrospectives? I have seen so many of those just be a waste of time meeting. Especially the feedback part, or what went well, what went wrong. Have you guys seen those actually consistently add value? I feel every project I've been on has done those poorly, I guess. Or maybe I'm missing the point of the meeting.
So I've seen like changing up the questions to make it more specific, maybe to the project. Those are the ones that I've seen go really well. So instead of just saying what went poorly, what could we do better, like what, those kinds of like just generic questions, we've changed it to like, what would you do again, or like what wouldn't you do? You know what I mean? So it's more of like actionable things of like, okay, we're going to add this into our process, or we're going to take this out because it didn't work so well. So sometimes it's just changing up like how you're asking the questions. I've seen that be successful. But some people are always like scared to speak up. That's what I see more often.
I've seen
than
that
anything
too, especially if it's like constructive feedback.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good tip though. Maybe I'll try that. Thanks, Ashley.
I mean, you're essentially asking people to say, yeah, I screwed up. I should have done this. I should have done that. Or my coworker who's sitting right next to me, they wasted a bunch of time on this, and I don't think that they should have. And that's going to be difficult. Like, I feel like kind of coming back to Ashley's point about culture, like you need to work on building a culture of openness where it's okay for me to say, I messed up, but I learned this lesson from it, so I will do better next time. And it's also okay for Liz to say, Merlin messed up, and then I don't have to feel some kind of way about it, so that you feel comfortable sharing that, so that all of us can get better as a team. Like that's not going to be easy.
Yeah, so you need openness and like trust that the person's not going to like get mad at you, retaliate, whatever, because you threw them under the bus, even if it was like with the best intentions, right?
Right. Or even if I belong in front of the bus, like that's literally where I put myself.
So how you have to create, sorry, I was going to say, I think you have to create that outside of just the Scrum part of your job though, too. Like you can't just decide to like, oh, okay, this one meeting every other month, whatever, however often you have it, we can be open and it's fine. You have to create the culture that like in every team meeting, you can call somebody out and say, hey, you said you were going to do this or you didn't. I think that is a really big piece, is creating that culture 100% of the time. So that way, when somebody does throw you under the bus, it's more of like a, oh gosh, like I let them down more so than like I screwed up.
Yeah. And like, they're not attacking you personally. It's meant to be helpful feedback. I think it's a really good point. You can't just have the culture for that one meeting. It needs to be the organizational culture.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to ask, in a client consultant perspective, because I'm a consultant, can you still have that, right? Because as a consultant, are you really going to say in front of the client, like, hey, we messed up?
I've had partners tell me they messed up before.
If you did, you should. Like that's my
I just
philosophy.
don't feel like it happens maybe as much as it should.
Oh.
Like I think some consultants like always want to put on just, we're perfect kind of front. And I think that's a barrier to actually having Scrum Agile work.
It comes down to the funding, right? Like if I admit that I screwed up, then I'm basically cutting into my own profits. And if my boss finds out that I'm giving away consulting hours, then my boss is going to get mad at me for cutting into their profits.
Or your personal, like if you're getting comped on billable hours and then you have to do a bunch of non-bill work, like it's affecting your personal finances.
Right.
But I think also it goes both ways, because I don't think partners always want to be honest with a customer and tell them when they screwed up either. Because they don't want to lose the business. Mm-hmm. So I think that it goes both ways, because I know that there's been times in the consultant role and also as a customer where I knew it was the end user who messed up. So it was either me or, the person I was working with. And you could never tell them. You always had to find some way to make it your own fault because you didn't want to make the customer angry. And so I think that, and I have no problem with any partner that I've ever worked at saying, I know it was me. I know I messed up. Like, let's just get that out of the way. Let's talk about what I did wrong so that it doesn't happen again. And I'm sure it will, but so I've always tried to create that culture as an end user, but I think that it goes both ways. It's not just the consultant admitting that they did something wrong. Like the customer has to admit it then too. And I think the consultant shouldn't be afraid to call them out on it.
That's also a very good point.
I would agree.
I've seen that happen.
Yeah. Too often, right?
So my theoretical approach to solve this, and I say theoretical because it's still getting off the ground, but my theoretical approach to this is if as a collective team, client and partner, you focus on the outcomes that you want to get out of your project. So not the features or the functionality, or I need to be able to click this button to get this report, but like I need to be able to effectively track customer support and make sure that requests aren't falling through the cracks, or I need to be able to track and understand my sales pipeline so that I can forecast sales into the future. If you focus on that outcome and both parties agree that they're focused on that outcome, then through the Agile process at each sprint, you can say, are we getting closer to solving this outcome? Is this functionality that we're deploying actually going to lead to this outcome? And then when you get to the end, which incidentally, you should be able to do fixed fee because it's just sprints over time, right? I've got a team, I just do sprints. You get to the end, and if you did not achieve those outcomes, first of all, it should not be a surprise because you were checking on it all the way along. And if for whatever reason the consultant did something wrong, they should say, well, you're right. Like I messed this up. I should have done this. I will just fix it so that you can get your outcome. But on the customer side, if they did something wrong, then the consultant should say, well, we talked about this and you said this was leading to the outcome. And now you're saying that it did not, in fact, lead to the outcome. There's no way that I could have helped you with that. So that one's on you. And be open and honest with each other for success, because hiding behind like payment terms and contract terms and be like, well, no, my legal department says that you're at fault. Like, okay, but that's not going to lead you to like successful business outcomes. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox.
It's definitely a different approach than what's, I think, traditionally being done at partners today.
But I think that it could completely change the relationship to a more positive one, because nobody ever wants to take the blame. So if you're willing to like call it out, you can just move past it more quickly. Because I've seen sometimes where people try to cover it up and then it's like it harbors internally and it creates just so many problems. And so if you were just upfront and honest about it, so you can just move past it and keep going, why not?
Right.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean you have to be a jerk about it. You don't have to be like, well, Ashley, because you're an idiot, this went wrong. And just be like, well, Ashley, next time, if you would have brought this up a little sooner, we could have fixed it.
Right.
And then
it's all about approach.
Right.
We all make mistakes.
Yeah.
I make a lot. It's okay. So any lasting thoughts like people need to know about Waterfall, Agile, switching, getting started?
I had one last thought, since, as Liz pointed out, we're kind of bashing Waterfall a lot. And I agree that Waterfall does apply sometimes. I think legitimately it probably works better in like an ERP situation than it does in like a Power Platform CRM-y sort of situation. Because if you're replacing your accounting system, like that is literally the heart of your organization. If you can't do these 10 things, like invoices won't go out and cash flow will disappear, like that's a problem. So I like in a critical state environment like that, where you need to have a set of functionality and it's the functionality that's critical, I think Waterfall is the right answer. But for everything else, if you can get by on something that mostly works, like 80% is good enough and we'll get that extra 20% over time, you will save so much time and get results faster if you go Agile, in my opinion.
So I didn't have anything else to say, but now that you said that, I have one last question for you, Merlin. Do you feel like ERP and Power Platform / CE projects can be run the same way using the same framework? Or do you think, based on that previous comment, that they need to have different approaches?
I feel like there's this magical utopia in which both projects can be run the same way and have success, like equally successful results. But I've never seen it happen in the wild, so I sort of presume that it cannot actually occur. I think there are too many differences. Like finance, you need to have a set of functionality in order to run the business. If I can't track my opportunities that well, I'll get by as long as I can still close them, right? Like there's a criticality component to it. And I think there's also like the personalities of the people involved. Like the CFO and the controller and the accounting staff are generally going to be a little bit more risk averse than maybe the marketing manager or the salespeople.
Understandably.
And so working with them in a way that's like, I don't know, we'll figure it out next week, is probably going to make them a lot more uncomfortable than the marketing person who's like, yeah, cool, let's figure it out next week. Or you try to pin down the marketing person, what are you going to want to do 6 months from now? They're going to be like, I don't know, I haven't figured that out yet.
Well,
the CFO knows.
And how about the technology part of it, though? I'm not an F&O person. Like, I'm not a functional F&O consultant, but from everything I've heard, it is way more inflexible. Like, just the setup and the configuration process is extremely different than the Power Platform or CE. And I think that also lends, like, how difficult it is to customize and configure F&O lends to it being Waterfall as well, a Waterfall approach.
Not even just difficulty, but also, like, consider the functionality. You need to keep track of your general ledger. There are only a couple of ways in which you can do that, right? Like, the process is defined. The process for accounts payable is defined. You don't need to build that process from the ground up. Like a sales process, I can have anything be my sales process. But if I'm billing customers, like, that process is pretty well defined. I don't need to be like, so after you put in the invoice, then what do you do?
Yeah, especially for an industry, like you can safely assume, I think, a lot of the ERP processes, like for manufacturing or for a particular industry, are really similar. Whereas, like, to your point, your customer service, sales, marketing process could vary greatly, even for similar organizations.
Yeah. Yep. So no, I don't think you can do both exactly the same way and be successful.
Awesome. Well, I think that wraps everything up for today. Really excited about the topic, and thanks for listening in. Thanks, Merlin and Liz.
Thank you for listening to the Dynamics Hot Dish podcast. For additional content and previous episodes, check out our website at dynamicshotdish.com, follow us on Twitter at dynamicshotdish, and subscribe to our podcast for notifications. Thanks. See you next time.